I'm not a political Nostradamus, but as my father liked to say, even a blind hog finds an acorn now and then. On the first week of April in 2016, just as the presidential primaries were cranking up in earnest, I published a warning as an op-ed in the Springfield News Leader. Please forgive me the vanity of reading large portions of that column to you here, but I believe that the events of the past week have made it relevant. Now, remember, this was written when Trump was only one of more than a dozen candidates. Mary Shelley metaphorically offered her fearful criticism of the burgeoning scientific age in the early 19th century in her classic novel, Frankenstein. In the end, the monster created by the scientific genius of Victor Frankenstein returns to his birthplace and confronts Victor. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey. Though science fiction and the cautious writings from the field of medical ethics have often treated the dangers that are akin to Shelley's imagined monster, the real threat of modernity is not medical technology. It came down to the machinery of warfare. And in the last generation, it has evolved into the dangers of mass media and the ability to manipulate the psyche of the public. The pamphleting of earlier centuries has given way to the much more passive communication of TV news and its nearly indistinguishable kin in paid advertisements, and now the even darker influence of social media. How does an absurd conspiracy theory such as Obama is coming for our guns get sustained in the absence of any evidence at all that there was even the most modest abatement of the inexplicable growth in the private ownership of lethal weapons? The simple explanation is the nearly fact-free drumbeat of social media and corporate news that has discovered that they can save themselves millions of dollars by simply punching the buttons of paranoia rather than fielding journalists and doing real reporting, such that they have now elevated lying to the status of reality. Conservatives have long used dog whistle topics to manipulate a fearful population to vote for the candidates that they claim will protect them from the imagined ravages of gay marriage, the prospects of Muslim immigrants imposing Sharia law in American cities, the outlawing of guns, the undocumented immigrants who harvest our crops, lay our bricks, and shingle our roofs, or transgendered people encountering us in a public restroom. For more than 30 years, from the days of the moral majority, the uninformed have been played by the Republican Party in every election cycle, continually feeding their fears of non-existent threats while actually rigging the economic system to transfer the wealth of the poor and the middle class into the hands of those at the top of the economic ladder. The voices of party sages, such as Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney, decrying the popularity of Donald Trump, gives evidence to the anxiety felt by traditional Republicans. But their warnings have only fueled the fire that their predecessors started. Richard Nixon blew the dog whistles of fear of communism and drug addicts. Reagan picked up the refrain about communists and added more about minorities, flavored with substantive fear of the poor and welfare queens. 30 years of constantly motivating their voting base by fear and prejudice has come home to roost. Though party elders want to declare that Donald Trump is not a true conservative, and even try to libel him by calling him a Democrat, the truth is that their propaganda inspired the creation and now, a la Mary Shelley, The monster has become the master. And as the novel unfolded 2 centuries ago, this is bound to end tragically for the Republican Party. We can only hope that they do not take our entire nation and the rest of the world into the flames of the monster's funeral pyre with them. Now again, I'm not claiming any unique political prognostication power, but I was right, and I have to say I enjoy that. But long before Donald Trump was declared to be the Republican nominee in 2016, it was evident, it was obvious that he was a danger to this country. Several of the people he was running against have either failed to distinguish themselves since then, or they have gone on to become even more frightening than they were in 2016. But Senators Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, and Marco Rubio, along with the Bush's favorite son, Jeb, all warned voters, just as I did in this article, that Trump would be a nightmare as a president, and if nominated, he would destroy the Republican Party. And they said that he was dishonest, greedy, and unprepared to hold office. Unlike me, several of them still ended up applying for positions in his administration and trying to attach their political futures to his coattails. But still, they were not wrong when they warned that he was unprepared, that he was greedy, and that he was dishonest. And today I think we can see that he has destroyed the Republican Party. It is in shambles. I'm not sure it can recover. Can you imagine Republican leadership from the days of Eisenhower looking at what the Republican Party has become? After the events of Wednesday afternoon, when thousands of Trump supporters at his direction had stormed the Capitol building, overwhelming the Capitol Police, occupying, looting, desecrating this symbol of democracy, literally spreading blood and feces over the statues and paintings and walls of the Capitol building. Most of his Republican sycophants are trying to distance themselves from Trump, except, of course, Ted Cruz, who has no evidence of a conscience, and the senator who really queued this event up, Missouri's own junior senator, Josh Hawley, who claims to be from the Springfield area, though he does not own property in Missouri. He uses his sister's address, and his sister is a dermatologist here in town. But here he is, seen just outside the Capitol building, displaying a raised fist, a sign of power, as a salute to the demonstrators who were on their way to the Capitol building to loot it. Now, you might want to say that he didn't know how far they were going to go. He didn't know they would be violent. He didn't know they would kill people, and that their protest would become an insurrection. But folks, after order was restored, and the joint session of Congress and the Senate reconvened around midnight, Wednesday night, our Josh Hawley rose to double down on his entirely evidence-free conspiracy theories, forcing the entire body of the Senate and the Congress to earn their exorbitant salaries by staying up all night in meaningless debate and votes so that Hawley could gain favor with the insurgents who had just attacked our government. He knew what he was doing. He is so bereft of character that he was literally grinning and proud of what he had done. Now, Thursday morning, FBI agents in Washington put out this very sincere-sounding tweet asking for leads to help them find those who instigated the violence around the Capitol on Wednesday. As if they didn't already know who the primary instigators were and where to find them. They could simply drive down to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, knock on the door, and arrest Donald J. Trump and his son, Don Jr., and his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who had cheered the crowds on to violence. And they will find on Capitol Hill Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and a whole, may I call them a basket of deplorables. Do you remember when that term seemed to be unnecessarily harsh and unreasonable for us to use, even though now, today, it falls far short of calling them a group of traitors or accusing them of sedition and calling them insurrectionists. So, basket of deplorables? You bet. The worst. Unlike the British invaders who set fire to the Capitol building during the War of 1812, these insurrectionists didn't set fire to the Capitol, but they did, just as I warned in my newspaper column, they did set fire to the Republican Party. I saw it coming, and folks, I am just a dumb country preacher. They should have seen it coming, because I'm no fortune teller. It was just that obvious. Trump is no politician. He is merely an attention-seeking, tiny little man who is now the Frankenstein's monster that 2 generations of Republican dog whistles created. From Nixon's fear-mongering during the Vietnam War to George H.W. Bush's threats about letting black rapists out of prison, to George W. Bush's use of fear of insurrection, Republicans have manipulated the uneducated, the fearful, and the paranoid with images of black murderers and rapists, of welfare queens, of drug addicts, of illegal immigrants, and communists and socialists. Nixon, Reagan, Bush Sr., and W. all knew what they were doing. They blew these dog whistles because they needed the votes of the gullible, voters who were easily manipulated. You don't really think that all those politicians, the day they left office, suddenly had an epiphany and they no longer were opposed to same-sex marriage, or that they, in spite of all of their catering to the religious right, suddenly became churchgoers, which none of them ever were. Well, the Reagans practiced astrology. I don't know if that's really a religion, but that's another issue. But decades of practice manipulation produced generations of voters who were, down in their brainstem, afraid of black and brown people, who actually did feel that they were impoverished not by tax benefits for the rich, but by poor immigrants who were coming to harvest our vegetables, or that their fragile marriages were threatened by the gay couple down the street, or that they were victims somehow because their cherished symbols of white supremacy were being challenged or removed as the Confederate flag was taken from state houses, monuments moved, and some of their favorite racial slurs used for sporting teams were being changed. Trump is the Frankenstein monster that they created through years of insincere, manipulative, prejudice-based fear-mongering and whistleblowing. Trump is the monster who actually does hate black and brown people, immigrants, homosexuals, and Native Americans. They finally got the candidate they've been trained to follow, and they followed him right into the heart of democracy in order to destroy it. Trump and associates have tried to dial it back after the insurrection failed, but please don't believe their disclaimers. If you've not seen it yet, let me share with you this brief clip.
Kimberly! couple of seconds here, guys. So check it out. Tune in. Do the live streaming. It's gonna be good. Shout out Mark Meadows, an actual fighter, one of the few, a real fighter. Thank you, Mark. Kimberly.
Yes, how's it going to do the right thing? Fight!
For our podcast audience, let me just tell you that you can find this on YouTube. Just search for Trump family celebrating demonstration or something like that. And you'll see the whole gang of family members and all of their staff and supporters watching multiple TV sets showing them as tens of thousands of their supporters from all over the country were gathering just before Trump went out to speak to them and to tell them that they had to use force, that they had to march down to the Capitol building. Of course, he lied to him. He told them that he would be there with him. He wasn't. But Don Jr. sends them his thanks for fighting for Donald Trump. 5 people died in this stupid stunt. One Capitol Hill policeman was struck on the head with a fire extinguisher, and when he was knocked to the ground, they literally kicked him to death. The governor of Maryland was calling repeatedly, saying that he could send in Maryland's National Guard, but he didn't get permission to do that because the Trump administration didn't want to stop the invasion. He had to be cajoled into saying anything at all. And even after they had murdered people, he told them that he loved them. Much has been made about how differently Black Lives Matter protests have been handled, but honestly, the tolerance shown to this mob was probably not because they were mostly white. It was because they were the invited guests of President Donald Trump. It even appears that some of the Capitol Police Force was in on the invasion and both helped them to get through checkpoints and even took selfies with them. They thought they were starting a revolution. They thought they were going to take over the government of the United States of America. They are traitors, but men and women, as dramatic as the events of the past week have been, this is not new, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who is paying attention. Today, some Republican lawmakers are trying to claim that it was Antifa that actually led the invasion. In fact, they have told that lie so many times that some of the people videoed within the Capitol building are claiming that it was Antifa that caused it when they were there themselves. That is the level at which lying and unreality is forced on the public. Now, as a preacher, I've been trying to turn the page, to focus on the future, to accentuate the positive things that are ahead of us. And folks, that's not wrong. There are still a lot of positive things ahead of us. I was shocked Tuesday. This week started so well and ended so badly. I was shocked when a young Jewish journalist and a black liberal preacher won Senate seats in Georgia, giving the Democratic Party a thin majority in the Senate. I am ready for the Biden administration to be installed and to kickstart our pandemic response and get real relief to the unemployed and the impoverished of our nation. I'm ready to move on. But 77% of Republicans still believe that the November election was rigged. Joe Biden has a huge job ahead of him, but he starts trying to unite a country where 40% of Republican voters believe that he was not fairly elected, and almost half of them are glad that a riot took over the Capitol building. It's difficult to even imagine how you communicate with someone who is, frankly, that ignorant. Social media has a lot of blame to bear in this level of anti-fact, conspiracy-driven public opinion. Twitter and Facebook just froze his accounts forever after the invasion of the Capitol. But they did that after Trump has told more than 30,000 lies. According to the Washington Post clock, 10,000 of which were delivered in the last 6 months. An entire army of fact checkers are going to become unemployed in 10 days. Like you, I am gravely worried about what might happen in the next 10 days. Wednesday's insurrection was a failure, but that may only mean that they will try something even more dangerous this week. Many of us have feared that Trump has been queuing up an attack on Iran, and I'm frankly afraid that he will use nuclear weapons. He would use nuclear weapons to throw the entire world politic into absolute disarray that might allow him to use the military to take over the United States. You only have to remember the 4 years of his fawning and praise for people who had made themselves dictators for life and his admiration for tyrannical and autocratic rulers. Rational people knew that Trump was dangerous before he was elected in 2016. He should have been impeached right after his insane inaugural speech 4 years ago. In fact, I made a cash wager with a friend that he would be impeached in a matter of months after that clear display of being an unhinged psychopath. And yet he has been protected by power-hungry Republicans. And now they are finding that the monster has become their master. I didn't personally watch any of the Game of Thrones episodes, but my friend Paul Tomlinson shared with me a quote, and applying it to Trump, he said he would gladly burn down the whole kingdom if he would be allowed to rule over the ashes. Trump and nearly 1/3 of Americans would destroy democracy and shred our Constitution if only they could stay in power. And that level of dysfunction is not going to go away just because we inaugurate a new president. I'm not going to tell you today that everything is going to be okay. I'd like to tell you that, but I don't know that it's true. Existing Republican leadership lacked the moral courage to remove Trump from office during the last 4 years, and even when they had an opportunity handed to them on a silver platter last year with the impeachment, they lacked the courage to do it. And even the storming of the Capitol has not raised their level of responsibility and courage. They are not going to use the 25th Amendment to declare the president to be what he clearly is, which is not capable of governing. They have left a desperate madman in possession of the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And so, the next week may very well be the most dangerous week in the history of the world. We can do little more than hope at this point that we will make it to January 20 intact. And then when sanity returns to the executive branch of government, we still have a public that has been fed lies and fear and prejudice for 50 years. This didn't start with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the monster that they assembled over generations. There is dishonesty and corruption in politics, regardless of the party, but we cannot afford to wallow in false equivalencies. The Democratic Party is clearly not exactly the Mensa Club, and they are subject to way too much corporate influence. But the fact that you could name maybe a dozen times when Joe Biden has exaggerated or lied in public, that doesn't make him the same as Donald Trump. I've already heard Republicans doing what they always do. They start to confess their own failings and then turn immediately to confess the failings of the Democratic Party. But you cannot compare Joe Biden's few lies to Donald Trump's 30,000 pieces of propaganda. That kind of false equivalency simply shows a lack of sincerity or a lack of intelligence. Donald Trump is a con man who, it seems to me, has actually fallen prey to his own cons. He seems to actually believe that he won the November election, even though there is no evidence to support that. And at least a third of adult Americans are willing to play along with that ridiculous conspiracy theory. I've been asked several times this week what individuals can do in the face of such public delusion and self-congratulatory conservatism and paranoia. How do you talk to your brother, your uncle, your neighbor, your coworker who is a part of this delusion? It's often true that modern proverb that says, you cannot, by reason and evidence, convince someone to change an opinion that they arrived at without reason and evidence. But I want to remind you of what I've pointed out to you a few times in the past. Not many of us grew up in progressive families. Most of us were brought up in churches that taught us fairy tales as if they were facts. Though I remember seeing Walter Cronkite trying to tell it that's the way it was each day at the end of the day, our families often believed in the conspiracy theories that floated around the neighborhood. We did not spring into the world as insightful and critical thinkers. We had to learn how to discard what was not true and have the courage to interrogate our own beliefs critically. We evolved into greater compassion and more progressive and inclusive views. All of us are still fighting the shadow of racial prejudice and partisanship that plays around in the dark recesses of our minds. We just have to keep holding the door open for others to discover their own path towards greater understanding. With kindness and with patience, day after day, for the next several years, we need to engage people from every tribe in meaningful conversation, both listening and speaking. Demand evidence, think critically, and don't compromise with conspiracy theories or religious myths. Could I beg of the clergy that listen to these podcasts, stop lying to your congregation because they want to hear your silly lies. Stop teaching them fairy tales. Get real with your people. Challenge others, but be willing to be challenged yourself. One of my favorite quotes from M. Scott Peck is, anything that cannot be questioned is an idol, and all idols are slated for destruction. Any belief that you have that you are not willing to examine and interrogate critically is probably not true. Because if it's true, you don't mind shining some light on it. Many times over the years, I've quoted Voltaire saying, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Well, that's never been more embodied than it was Wednesday afternoon. Trump has pilloried his largely uneducated and gullible followers with lies and lies and lies and conspiracy theories and fraudulent propaganda for years until they actually believed it. And then they were vulnerable to his suggestion that they commit atrocities, that they break down the doors of our Capitol building, even crushing some of their own under the weight of their press to commit this desecration. It is our job to keep countering these absurdities with a steady supply of unvarnished truth. We cannot stop people from spewing absurdities, but we can make rational facts and ethical deliberation a part of the public conversation. That's what our country needs. That's what our country needs the most. And we are obligated to do everything we can to try to recover a healthy democracy for the sake of America and as a standard of hope for everyone worldwide who are watching us and hoping that we regain our sanity.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.